I was so excited to work for John Kerry, and he turned out to be a coward. Just a mainstream nobody. All he ever talked about was how desperately he wanted to be Secretary of State and how he got ripped off and Hillary Clinton stole his job from him. There were only 2 times when I ever gave John Kerry unsolicited advice. Once, it's a little bit of a story, he asked me to write him a speech. He had a speechwriter, but on stuff that was like really specific to the Middle East, I did it. So he's going to give a speech at it's like the Smithsonian Institution or Council on Foreign Relations, something. I don't remember anymore. This is 2009. Let me back up, actually. So in 2008, I had my own little business. And Mac McLarty, who had been Bill Clinton's chief of staff at the White House, Mac very generously offered me an office and a part-time secretary in McLarty Associates. Back then it was Kissinger McLarty. I was very indebted to him. He was very kind to me. So one of the guys on the board of directors of McLarty was Governor Bill Richardson, Congressman Bill Richardson, Secretary of Energy Bill Richardson, Ambassador of the United Nations Bill Richardson. And Bill and I loved each other. I even voted for him for president in 2008 after he quit the race. And I told him, Bill, I still voted for you. Anyway, we really got along. And so he comes into my office. Let me think of the date. It was like January of 2008. December 2007, something like that. No, it wasn't. It was February of 2008. He says, hey, you have a minute? I said, of course. He said, something crazy happened over the weekend. He said, I invited Obama to my house to watch the Super Bowl. Super Bowl is like first Sunday in February now. And he said, at halftime, we went for a walk, put his arm around. And he said, Bill, if you can endorse me and you bring the Hispanic vote, Secretary of State. I said, you going to do it? He goes, of course I'm going to do it. I said, awesome. He goes, I want you to be my deputy chief of staff. I said, done. I'll take it. His chief of staff from when he was governor, really sweet guy. He was going to be chief of staff. I said, I'm in. I'll take it. So the months are passing. Like, oh my God, I can't believe. And Obama's going to win. And Richardson's going to be Secretary of State. And I'm going to be ambassador to Greece. Or, it's going to be awesome. November comes, Obama wins. So the day after the election, I go into the office and I go like this. I go, Mr. Secretary, congratulations. He goes, man, I am so excited. I can't even sleep. I'm so excited. A couple of weeks later, I'm in the shower and I had a radio in my, bathroom sitting on the sink. And I'm listening to the news station in DC, WTOP, and they said, former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson has been tapped by President-elect Obama to be Secretary of Commerce. And I was like, what? So I get dressed. I go into the office and I go, Mr. Secretary, congratulations. He goes like this. He goes, what the fuck do I know about commerce? Tell me, what the fuck do I know about commerce? And I said, no. We can make something out of this. I go, there's the Foreign Commercial Service. I said, there's the International Trade Representative. We can turn this into something. You do it for the first term and then Secretary of State in the second term. He goes, I'm so mad I could explode. A couple of more weeks pass. Same thing. I'm in the shower. I got the news on and they said, former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson has withdrawn his nomination to be Secretary of Commerce. I was like, fuck. So I go in the office and he said, I couldn't do it. But he said, I honestly have zero interest in trade. Nothing. I said, no, that's cool. I'll figure something out. Then I get hired by Kerry. So I write this speech with him. One of the things about Kerry I always hated is he thinks he's smarter than everybody else in the room. And so you've got this very carefully scripted speech for him to write, and he'll just start winging it and meandering all over the place. And his sentences have no verbs in them. And you don't know what the heck he's talking about or what the point is. And then he can't remember where he left off. And he's like looking at the different sheets of paper. I hated when he would do that. So I think it was at the Smithsonian we must have been. And he's reading the speech. He's giving the speech, the Middle East, the peace process and all this stuff. And then he says, I was supposed to be the Secretary of State. And I thought, oh no. And he says, I invited President Obama to my house for Christmas. So this is like 4 or 5 weeks before Richardson. And he said, they're sitting there having a drink. And Obama says, John, if you endorse me and you can bring the Kennedy family along, Secretary of State. So Kerry, nobody remembers this. Kerry was the first senator to endorse Obama. And a week later, the whole Kennedy family endorses Obama. It was a big deal because Kerry was close to the Clintons. And both Kerry and Hillary were on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee together. And he says, but, that's Washington politics. I got screwed. So afterwards I said, Senator, you can't say in public that you were supposed to be Secretary of State. I said, Bill Richardson tells exactly the same story. I said, Obama promised half a dozen people in Washington that they would be Secretary of State. He promised, what's his face that died at the State Department? I forget his name now. The special negotiator for Yugoslavia. Anyway, he's promising everybody they're going to be Secretary of State. That was the one time. And he goes, I know, I'm still bitter. I can't help it. The other time, I get a call from the Lebanese ambassador. And he's like, what's your boss's problem? I said, well, now what did he do? He says, he gave an interview and he keeps calling Bashar al-Assad, my dear friend Bashar al-Assad. I said, I'll talk to him. So I said, Senator, the Lebanese ambassador called me and you have to stop calling Bashar al-Assad my dear friend. And he's like, well, he is my dear friend. And I said, be that as it may, he's a genocidal maniac who just wipes out entire swaths of his population. And he goes, well, we rode motorcycles together down to the Golan Heights and we exchanged, a relationship. I said, I get it. He's probably a lovely guy, but he's a genocidal dictator. He's like, all right. Tell the Lebanese, get off my back. So it's like, dude, what are you doing? Another thing about Kerry, I've said this a couple times, but I think it's important enough to repeat. When he first called me to offer me this job, I didn't know this job existed. So he calls me and he says, and I had never met him, but I was friendly with people who actually, I won't give names, but I was friendly with two guys that he served in Vietnam with. And they both said, hey, you should talk to John Kiriakou. So he called me and he said, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee used to have an investigative function, but it was zeroed out in 1972. And I'm going to bring it back. And I want to do hard-hitting investigations. And I said, that sounds like my sweet spot. So he said, why don't you come up? We'll have a chat. We can see if we're a fit for one another. I said, great. I put on a suit. I go up to his office. You walk into his office. He was in the Russell Senate office building, the historic office building with the 15-foot ceilings. Literally from the floor to the ceiling were framed pictures of him with every world leader who matters, from Gorbachev to the Dalai Lama to the Pope to everybody. It's like, okay, kind of narcissistic, but all right, he's a senator and a presidential candidate and, big war hero. I didn't even care about that. But you walk into the office and immediately next to the door, there was a small credenza. It had 3 things on it. First, it had a framed picture of him with John Lennon. And they were like in this weird embrace, making funny faces and like doing noogies, right? Very cool. John Lennon, right? Beatle. Very cool. On the other side of the credenza was a picture of him with Peter, Paul, and Mary, the folk group from the 60s. And he was close to them. He gave the eulogy at Mary Travers' funeral. I get it. They're all from Massachusetts. But in the middle was a shadow box. And in it had his silver star, his bronze stars, and his purple heart. Well, in 1972, he famously threw his medals over the White House fence to protest the Vietnam War. It was national news that this hero just came back from Vietnam, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and in an act of defiance, threw his medals at Richard Nixon over the White House fence. So we agree, I'm going to do the job. It's going to be fun. He wants me to investigate this, that, and the other thing. I walk out. The staff director of Foreign Relations Committee was a member of the Kennedy family. So we're walking out, and that was really my connection. I knew him. And he said, so it went well. And I said, yeah, it went well. I'm going to take the job. But I said, I got to ask you, what's up with the medals? I mean, everybody in America knows he threw his medals over the White House fence. He went to the PX and bought copies of the medals and threw the copies over the White House fence. He goes, those medals are the most important thing in his life. He would never have thrown those medals over the fence. I said, the entire John Kerry mystique is based on that one act of defiance. He goes, yeah, well, welcome to Washington.
You would think maybe you'd leave the medals at home in a shadow box.
You'd think? Exactly.
Not in the office for everyone to see.
He was really very cold in a patrician Yankee New England kind of way. He had a Christmas party at his house that year. It was Christmas of '09. He lived in this rare single-family home in Georgetown that he later sold for $12.5 million. Georgetown doesn't have more than a small handful of single-family homes. But he wouldn't allow anybody in the house. It's December in Washington. It's 20 degrees. So it has a side yard surrounded by a brick wall. And he just rented these propane heaters. So we're all standing out there. And he says, well, we have a special guest that's going to come to the party tonight. We're all like, trying to keep warm because these heaters aren't doing the trick. And then Joe Biden comes. He was vice president at the time. So Biden comes, and Biden was exactly the opposite of Kerry. Biden's standing at the entrance to the backyard or to the side yard, and he goes, "Hey," like this. Everybody's like, "Hey, Mr. Vice President, good to see you." So he comes down and starts shaking hands with everybody, one at a time. Great eye contact. "Hi, Joe Biden. Tell me your name again." You know, that kind of thing. I said, "Mr. Vice President, we've met a number of times. You probably don't remember me. I'm from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and my dad was best friends with Angelo Sands." He goes, "Angelo Sands from 7th grade?" And I said, "Yeah, your best friend from 7th grade." He says, "I do remember you. We talked about Angelo's a taxi driver in Las Vegas now." I said, "That's right.
Wow.
He is a taxi driver. Great memory." I said, "That conversation was 15 years ago." And then he says to the guy next to me, "I remember you. I don't like you." And then he looks at Kerry, and Kerry just is like, "I don't like him either." And they walk away. I said to the guy, "What the fuck?" He said, "Biden has hated me since I told him in a memo that we should pull out of Afghanistan." And I said, "Sweethearts, these guys are." And he's like, "Yeah, well, what are you going to do? Washington, D.C., every man for himself." Harry Truman once said, "If you want a friend in Washington, buy a dog." There it is. The role of a case officer is very, very simple. It's to recruit spies to steal secrets. Period. That's it. Now, it's more complicated than that in the actual implementation of the job, but the goal is really that simple. So, people have this romantic view that you're going to infiltrate a terrorist group. No, you're not. Most of those guys have blonde hair and blue eyes and don't speak a word of Arabic. You're not infiltrating anybody. But you're going to find somebody who can infiltrate a terrorist group. So there's something called the asset acquisition cycle. This is the very first thing that they teach you when you go into case officer training. The asset acquisition cycle is spot, assess, develop, recruit. You have to spot someone who's going to be what they call operationally interesting. For example, you are a nice guy. I like hanging out with you, but you're not operationally interesting to me because you don't have access to classified information and you don't have access to a terrorist group. So we may go out and have a beer, but I'm not going to actively seek to recruit you and to make you a CIA asset. Now, we also call assets agents. I wasn't a CIA agent. I was a CIA officer, and the person I recruited is the agent. So spot, assess, develop, recruit. In a perfect world, I'm going to go to a diplomatic cocktail party, and I'm going to spot a Russian, a Chinese, a Cuban, an Iranian, a North Korean, etc., etc. And then I'm going to say, "Hey, how about lunch?" And I'm going to take you to lunch. And I'm going to pay, of course, because I have a budget that is literally unlimited. Literally. And then I'm going to take you to dinner. And then I'm going to invite you and your wife to dinner with my wife and me. And then our wives are going to become friends. And you're going to mention to me that you like fishing. And so I'm going to charter a boat and I'm going to take you deep sea fishing and we're going to have a blast. And then your wife is going to say how much she enjoys living in that city because the skyline's so beautiful. So I'm going to rent a helicopter and we're going to go on a sunset helicopter tour of the skyline. And then our kids are going to become friends. And we're going to get to the point in between 9 and 18 months where you consider me to be your best friend. We're best friends. Now, I have a personality where I can manipulate people like that. I can turn it on and off. And I'm not proud of that. It's just the way my brain is wired. Some guys can't turn it off. And that's why they have 5 marriages and they, go to prostitutes and they steal from people and, whatever. I did it because I believed we were the good guys and I was doing it in service to my country. So after 9 months, I'm also going to be looking for what we call vulnerabilities. Now, a vulnerability may be that you really, really love your kids. Now, because you love your kids so much, you want your kids to go to the best university. Well, not only can I get your kid into the best university, and just name the university, Stanford, Harvard, Millersville State College, I don't care. Pick it, we'll get them in. But I'll pay for it if you give me 2 hours in your code room, or you give me the plans to that new Russian tank, right? Or a soil sample from your nuclear power plant. I'll do whatever you want. But I can only have that conversation if you are my best friend. Now, let me back up to the application process for a moment. When we were going through the application process, a bunch of us in the room, the interviewer said, let's go over a scenario. Let's say, and remember, none of us have been hired yet. Let's say you're a CIA officer overseas and you get a cable from headquarters saying that they need for you to get, let's say, the latest Indonesian trade numbers. What do? Everybody agreed. We invite the Indonesian economic officer to lunch. Okay, that's how you start. And then you invite him to dinner. And then you invite him to dinner with his wife and your wife, just like I laid out. But after 9 months, you determine that this guy's not recruitable. He doesn't have any vulnerabilities. He doesn't need any money. He doesn't have any kids. He's perfectly happy in his life. There's no hook for you to recruit him. What do? One guy raised his hand and he said, you double down. Even if it takes another year, you just keep working him. Maybe something will come up. One guy raised his hand and said, maybe you bring your wife into it, which is a big no-no. Unless she's CIA and she gets approved from headquarters. Bring your wife into it. Maybe the wife can talk to his wife. And I'm looking around like, it seemed obvious to me. I raised my hand. I said, you break into his embassy and steal it. He goes, that's exactly what you do. That's exactly what you do. You write to headquarters, you say, send out a locks and picks team. We're gonna break into the embassy at 2 o'clock in the morning. We're gonna take down the security cameras. We're gonna steal the document, get back out, turn the cameras back on. Nobody has any idea we were there. And I thought, I could do that. I have kind of a knack for that. Sure. And then, that was another thing. You have to be able to think very, very quickly on your feet. I had to do a break-in one time. We believed that there was a woman who was a member of a terrorist group, and we believed that she had one of the weapons in her apartment. So I flew out to this country, and I was working with the host country intelligence service. It was a joint operation, so everything was on the up and up.
I'm assuming you can't say where that was.
No. And so I fly in, my people pick me up, they take me to the intelligence service headquarters for the briefing. So I meet their team and they said, here's the scenario. She lives in this luxury apartment building. There are 2 apartments on every floor. So it's this tall, skinny apartment building, condo building. So she's on the 6th floor. She's the apartment on the left. So there's A and B. I said, so who's in B? They said, don't worry about it. It's a government employee, married to a lawyer, and they're both at work. I said, okay, great, this will be easy. So they say, the target, every single day, she leaves her apartment at 10 o'clock, she buys a newspaper, and she goes to a coffee shop. He said, we're gonna have a team on her to make sure that she doesn't leave the coffee shop early. She usually stays there an hour or 2. If she leaves early, we'll call and abort the operation. I said, perfect. This is gonna be a piece of cake. So we get to the apartment building. We didn't want to take the elevator because the elevator makes a sound. So I go with a lock picker and we walk up the 6 flights. And just like they said, there's apartment A and apartment B. So the lock picker puts his little tool into the lock and he starts doing this to jimmy it. He's got these tools that look like very thick needles, right? Doing this. And I hear a voice in apartment B. And I was like, that's gotta be a mistake. Apartment B's at work. And I hear a baby cry, like a newborn baby. And I was like, oh my God, she just had a baby and they didn't know it. And she's on maternity leave. I'm thinking to myself, the guy is doing the lock, like as silently as possible. And I hear a woman's voice say in Arabic, I think there's someone outside in the hall. And I go, stop. So he stops, he's just frozen. And then the husband says, I don't hear anything in the hall. I go, and he starts doing it. And then she says, no, I think I hear something out there. I go, stop. And he stops. And we're frozen. And the husband says, you're imagining things. There's nothing out there. And he starts doing this. And she says, I definitely hear something. And she opens the door. And just as she opens the door, I turn to block him. And she says, who are you? And I said, hi. I go, Anna Mohammed Ahmed. I'm Mohammed Ahmed. I said, I'm looking for my aunt, Miriam Ahmed. And she goes, there's no Miriam Ahmed here. I said, is this, 123 Main Street? And she's like, no, this is 125 Main Street. 123's next door. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. And she said, okay. And she looks at me funny. And I said, congratulations on your baby. She's holding the baby. She's like, thank you. And she goes back in and closes the door. And I go, go. And it clicked. And we went into the apartment. I was like, man, that was the closest call I ever had. So we never found the weapon. We never found anything in there of interest. And then we waited until they were going about their business again. And then we, as quietly as possible, left. And afterwards, we met up with, it's called a hot wash. You go over the entire operation. We went back to the headquarters. I was like, you guys, like, seriously fucked up. They were both, the whole family was in that apartment. Yeah, that was a close one.
Your first case officer job, you go to Greece, which was probably nice for you.
Yeah, it was great.
What were you doing over there?
I was very specifically assigned to disrupt a terrorist group called Revolutionary Organization 17 November. It was the deadliest terrorist group in the history of Greece. They had murdered 28 people, including the CIA station chief, 2 American defense attachés, and a poor, hapless Air Force technical sergeant doing his laundry in the basement laundry room of his apartment building. They were incredibly lethal and successful and extraordinarily dangerous to all Americans in Greece. Greece was ranked as what's called critical threat for terrorism in those days. Critical is the highest level threat. We spent more money on security in Athens than we spent in Beirut at the time.
And what year was this, by the way?
1998 to 2000. The Greeks ended up cracking the group in 2002. It no longer exists. But that was one incredibly tough job. And to make it tougher, we weren't able to identify a single member of the group. They were so good at masking their identities. We had suspects. We had 500 suspects, and the group only ended up having but a dozen people in it. But there were other groups. There was one called Popular Revolutionary Struggle. There was one called Revolutionary Nuclei. There was Sons of the Anarchic something or other. I forget. They were mostly anarchist groups, but Popular Revolutionary Struggle and Revolutionary Organization 17 November were legitimate terrorist groups.